So now that we've talked about the parts of the digestive system, we're going to talk about the processes or the things that happen during digestion. And they have fancy words because scientists always like to use fancy words. So this can be your title for your notes page, or if you're in the notes packet, you can just follow along here. The first one we're going to talk about is ingestion. And ingestion is placing food in your mouth. And so I want you to write this definition down. If I ingest something, I'm eating something. So this is eating, okay? On our diagram, we're going to label this with a blue dot. So either on your parts diagram or on a separate diagram, you can label it with a blue dot. If you don't have markers, don't worry. You're just going to write down where this happens. So if you don't have markers and you don't want to color like a blue dot by the mouth, you can just write down underneath your definition here, happens in the mouth, or mouth in parentheses, okay? So where we eat happens in our mouth. So we're going to talk about the definition for these words and then where they happen. Next up, we have something called peristalsis. And these are muscular contractions. They move food down the esophagus and throughout the entire digestive tract. Now, peristalsis is responsible for helping move this food throughout your system. Sometimes you might, when you chew or take a bite of something too big and you swallow it and you feel like it gets stuck in your throat, normally it doesn't ever stay there. And the reason it doesn't stay there is because you actually have muscles that are helping to squeeze and push it down. So this happens throughout your entire digestive tract. Otherwise, it'd be really hard to move things. If we think about, for example, like the intestines, some of those intestines don't go down, right? They might go to the side, they might go up. And so in order to move food, we need something kind of moving them along. So it moves food down the esophagus and through the entire digestive tract, out through the rectum and the anus. So we're going to label this with a yellow dot. Now, theoretically, we're going to put the yellow dot here in the esophagus, but it happens throughout the entire digestive system. So theoretically, we could put yellow dots the whole way here, okay? Our next word, absorption. This is where things get absorbed. And where they get absorbed is in our small intestine, right? It's moving into our bloodstream. It's our connection with the circulatory system. So we have our little capillaries. Remember, they're inside the villi, those little finger-like projections. So absorption happens in our small intestine. So we're going to label this with a green dot. If you don't have markers or don't want to label it like that, you can just write that it happens in the small intestine. Next up, we have storage. Storage is exactly what it sounds like. It's storing things. And where does this happen? This happens in the liver. Remember when we talked about plants? They make sugar through photosynthesis and they store it as starch. We stained some of those roots with iodine and they turn purple. We know we store it as starch. We actually store carbs as glycogen in the liver. So one of the things we talked about is how complex carbohydrates, big carbohydrates, polysaccharides, are used for energy storage or long-term energy. And what happens is if you're not eating enough, the carbohydrates, the glycogen in the liver, those are the big molecules, get broken down into simple sugars and then sent to your bloodstream where your body can use them. And so this is a way that you can store energy or store sugar for later on. So we're going to label this with a red dot or just go ahead and write down happens in the liver. Next up, we have mechanical digestion. So whenever you see the word mechanical, it means like physically moving. And so this is physically chewing or churning. And so you can see I put in parentheses here the two places that this happens. In your mouth, you're using your teeth and your tongue to move food around. And in the stomach, remember your stomach's a muscle and it's squeezing and churning to mix up the food. So we're going to label this with an orange dot. And so it happens in two places. So we're actually going to have two orange dots here. Next up, we have chemical digestion. This is when we use enzymes and acids, chemicals, to digest our food. If you think about where chemical digestion happens, where are there chemicals? Where are there enzymes and acids? Lots of different places. We talked about amylase in the mouth to digest carbohydrates, pepsin in the stomach to digest proteins, and then in our small intestine, we get all of the enzymes from the pancreas, and we get bile from the gallbladder. And so chemical digestion really happens throughout the whole first part of the digestive tract, right? In our stomach, our mouth, and our small intestine. We're going to label this with a purple dot. So you see mouth, stomach, small intestine. And last but not least, we have elimination, removal of waste. Eliminate it from the body. And where does this happen? This happens at the end of the digestive tract. So we're going to go ahead and label the rectum and anus here. Remember that anus is controlled by a sphincter, a ring of muscles, with a brown dot. The last couple of slides here, we have 3 slides left, and it is just talking about what happens to all of the end products once they're absorbed. What happens to all of the carbohydrates, proteins, fats that we've broken down and absorbed into our bloodstream? So the first thing that happens is they could be delivered to the cells and used for energy. So we can deliver glucose to the cells, and then they can use that sugar to create energy. And we'll talk about the exact process and the way that that happens. But the proteins, carbs, fats can be delivered to cells used for energy. They could also be stored, like in the liver. I have a picture of a vacuole here. Remember, vacuoles store things in cells, but they could be stored in the body, right? We know that fat is stored for long-term energy later on. We know that complex carbohydrates are stored, so they could be stored. Or they could be used to make other molecules. So when we're thinking about making new cells, we have to have the building blocks to make new cells. And those building blocks come from the carbs, proteins, and fats that you eat. Remember, they're made out of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen, and all of those are used to create molecules for cell membranes or parts of the cell or muscle fibers. So the last thing that could happen is they could be used to produce other molecules.